Hi there, welcome to lesson 5. Today we are going to cover stage 3, implementation phase of the improvement science methodology. As you can recall from this slide on improvement science methodology, you can see that the improvement science methodology comprises of 5 phases. Today we are going to focus on phase 3, which is the implementation or the intervention phase. This phase requires you to implement the changes using a series of PDSA cycles. So the objectives for today's lesson is for you to understand the PDSA cycles and also to describe the steps for each stage of the cycle. So for section 1, let us find out more about what is PDSA cycle. So the PDSA cycle is a 4-step model for testing out a change. It develops a plan to test the change, carry out the plan, observe and learn from the consequences as a result of this so-called plan, and then determine whether there is a need to make modification to it. The PDSA cycle is also known as the Shewhart cycle, Deming cycle, or PDCA cycle. So you can see that the PDSA cycle is a series of test evaluate cycle as follows. Usually you start off with a small scale test, followed by a follow-up test, and then once you think that it's good enough, you can actually implement the test organization-wide. And if you think that the test is more or less done, you can then make the change permanent. To achieve improvement change, you cannot depend on a single PDSA cycle. This slide shows you that it is important for you to perform a series of PDSA cycles to achieve improvement changes. So as you can see, right, the PDSA cycle is continually moving up the so-called ramp. What does it mean is that when you first started off of the first PDSA cycle, it should be a very small scale test. And thereafter, you will have to perform follow-up tests before you implement it organizational wide. And finally, once you think the change is good enough, then you can make it as a permanent change. So why do we advocate for the use of PDSA cycle? First of all, it provides you a standardized method to achieve continuous improvement. It can be used easily by anyone who is trained in it. It also helps to foster teamwork through the brainstorming and problem-solving process. This whole method is very inexpensive. It also helps you to prevent the waste of time. When you plan, you are able to sieve out those ineffective or inferior solutions. Last but not least, you are also able to contextualize the so-called ideas and solutions for your internal workplace context. Now let us have a closer look at the steps required for each stage of the PDSA cycle.
This module will introduce the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. By the end of this module, learners will be able to define the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle, including why and how to use it, define and discuss the key components of the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle, discuss scaling down your change ideas using the Drop-To principle, and finally, share tips on testing multiple change ideas in parallel using Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles for quick and efficient assessment. Once your team has established the aim of your project, determined how you will measure improvements, and identified specific changes you want to make, the next step is to test the changes using the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle, or PDSA cycle. The PDSA cycle allows your team to plan how you will test a change, try the change on a small scale, make observations about the results of a change, and take action based on what was learned by adapting, adopting, or abandoning a change. Basically, the PDSA cycle is the scientific method used to rapidly learn and take action. You can use the components of the PDSA cycle to guide your test. First, plan how the change will be tested. What do you hope to learn by testing the change? What will happen when you test the change? How will the change be carried out? Be specific about who, what, when, and where. How will you collect data, both qualitative and quantitative data? And again, remember to be specific about who, what, when, and where. Second, try the change as planned on a small scale. Remember to test it with 1 to 2 people for a short amount of time prior to implementing on a larger scale. Make observations and collect data as you try the change, and document any problems as you try the change. Next, Take time to study the data collected. Compare the data to the predictions made, and reflect on the data and what was learned. Finally, act on what you've learned. Determine whether the change should be adapted, adopted, or abandoned. Make adaptations to the change. Plan how you will try the change with the new adaptations. Then, start over with a new PDSA cycle to test the same change again, but including these new adaptations. Complete this process as many times as possible until you feel the change is ready to implement on a wide scale. Each time you complete a PDSA cycle, you build knowledge, data, and confidence that a change is ready to implement. A change does not always achieve the results we expect, so it is important to test on a small scale before wide-scale implementation. This includes the time frame you're testing, as well as the number of people you test with. Remember to start small. Many times, our initial thought is to test on a large scale. For example, your team has created a new form. Your first response may be to print copies and try it with all clients for the next month. But what if you print 500 copies of the form and later learn that the form does not capture the information needed, and it has spelling errors? One tip to help you try changes on the smallest scale possible is the scaling down or drop to principle. When you have a change and you think, let's test this change for the next month, scale down the change by 2. Let's test this change for a day. Testing on a small scale will also allow your colleagues to try the change and give feedback before it is implemented across the entire organization. This will increase buy-in and help reduce resistance to the change. To increase your confidence that the change will be effective in the future, try it under many conditions. Test with different people, those who are most experienced with the process and those with the least experience. Test under special situations. For example, different shifts, units, seasons, etc. Test when someone says, "It won't work because..." This will give you additional opportunities to test the change and can help narrow down multiple situations in which to test. Most often, multiple changes are needed to change an entire system or process. This will require your team to try multiple changes at the same time, or in parallel. For example, if your team is working to improve the efficiency of a process, you could potentially test 3 to 5 changes at the same time, such as resequencing the order of the process steps, reallocating appointment times, scripting reminder calls to clients, etc., by breaking down your team into subgroups of 1 to 3 people to test each change. Testing in parallel allows you to test, learn, and adapt changes in a rapid fashion, leading to rapid improvement. Now let's try it. Think about a change you want to make, either in your personal life or at work. How can you use the PDSA cycle to try the change on a small scale? Think about the following questions. What will you test? What do you hope to learn from trying the change? How can you apply the drop to principle? How can you try the change on the smallest scale possible?
The planning stage requires you to generate and plan solutions for the testing. So this stage requires you to perform at least 4 steps. The first step is actually to state the questions or the objective you want to answer, and then probably make a prediction about what you think will happen. Then the second step is actually to generate as much solutions as possible and then decide which solutions are worth implementing. Then the third step is actually to develop a plan to effect the so-called change using the who, what, when, where technique. And finally, the last step is actually to identify what data you will collect to evaluate the change later. There are several QI tools that you can use at this stage to generate solutions. One of them is brainstorming, the other one is literature review, the third one is called benchmarking. That is a technique that we use to look at other people's hospital practices, and then if we find that the practices is very useful and we are not doing it at the moment, we can actually borrow the idea and use it as a comparison. The fourth one is called the affinity diagram, which is actually like a flow chart or a tree diagram that helps you to explore possible solutions, list out the solutions that are related to the so-called problem, and then you can actually prioritize which solution is more applicable or useful for implementation. So have a look in the internet, find out more about these techniques so that it can help you with the solution generation. So for the doing stage, it requires you to pilot and implement solutions. Try to stick to your plan as close as possible. And during the so-called implementation, if you encounter any problems, deviation, or unexpected observation, do document down. And finally, always remember to collect the data at the so-called period that you specify in your plan. And then once you have collected the data at the study stage, you will be required to analyze the data as a team, then compare the data with your prediction, whether it meets your predictions, and finally reflect on what you have learned during the so-called implementation. So after you have done your study, the next thing is to act. Determine the next course of action. So what are you going to do about it after you have found out the so-called data? Are you going to adapt, make modification, and run another test? Are you going to adopt the changes, but this time around on a larger scale? Or are you going to completely reject or abandon the test because it has not been successful? So this is where you also need to prepare a plan for the next so-called PDSA cycle. Now let's watch a video to see how we can apply the PDSA cycle to healthcare setting.
Hello. This short animation is going to demonstrate the use of the model for improvement in a QI project. The specific subject here is fasting times before elective surgery, but the model can be applied to almost anything. Like most other projects, ours started by gathering a project team, including all members of the multidisciplinary team, including patients too. We started by setting an aim. This may seem obvious and an unnecessary step, but a clear and succinct aim will help you to keep your focus and avoid your project spreading into other areas. Remember to make it SMART. That is, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. We decided to limit our scope to same-day elective patients, excluding obstetric, peds, cardiac, and neuro, and concentrate on fluids as this has the best evidence base. We initially set ourselves a deadline of 3 months for improvement. The next question in the model is about measurement, which you can read more about in our measurement learning module. We chose to measure average nil-by-mouth times. You could also measure a number of patients above a certain set standard, but we chose average measures for simplicity. There are also a host of process measures, feedback from staff and patients, percentage of staff completing our information cards, etc., etc. And we have balancing measures, measuring the number of delays or cancellations, as our changes could have adverse effects which we need to know about. The last question in the model is about what changes you can make that would lead to an improvement. We came up with some ideas by asking staff and patients for their ideas, asking other hospitals how they manage this, and searching online and in journals for similar projects. So then we take each improvement idea and put it into a PDSA cycle. That means we plan how we're going to make our improvement intervention, then we do it, then we study it by measuring the impact that has, and then we act on the results. That might mean modifying our intervention or trying something different. Then we come up with a modified plan and go around the cycle again. So our first idea was to try a patient-held document, which staff filled in with personalised nil-by-mouth information on the morning of surgery. We planned it out and then implemented it. Then we studied the effects this had on our measured fasting times and other balancing and process measures. We found this had a very small effect on fasting times, and our feedback was that staff forgot to fill it in, or patients lost it, or it accidentally got filed in the notes. So we decided not to pursue that idea any further and to try another. Our next idea was to ask staff to record and display nil-by-mouth advice on a whiteboard, so everyone could easily see this information and we weren't relying on verbal handovers of information. This had a bigger impact on average nil-by-mouth times, and our feedback was that most anaesthetists found this easy to do and completed the information as requested. Reassuringly, we also didn't see any increase in delays or cancellations. We still wanted to involve patients in our improvements, so we decided that in our next improvement cycle, we would emphasise fasting times and slightly change our preoperative patient information on fasting. We found that this had another positive effect on our fasting times. You can see that by testing and refining change ideas in turn, you can accumulate quite a big improvement over many improvement cycles. However, over the next few weeks, our average time started to creep up, We looked at why that might be and found that compliance with our new processes was slipping, which is quite common after any change. You can see that keeping an eye on data and a range of outcome and process measures is very important to know how you're doing. So in our next cycle, we concentrated on sharing information and educating our colleagues to improve compliance with what we had already changed. Thankfully, this had the desired effect and our average times improved again. You can carry on changing and refining your process across a number of cycles, or you can then formalise what you've changed as official hospital policies once you're happy that they're working well. So, in summary, we've seen how the model for improvement can help us plan and execute an improvement project. Good luck with your project.
Now that we understand how a PDSA cycle can be applied to healthcare, the next slide will show you how to create a PDSA cycle diagram using PowerPoint. We have come to the end of today's lesson. These are the summary points. For the implementation phase, we'll be using the PDSA cycles. This PDSA cycle consists of 4 steps as shown in the slides. Thank you for your time.